Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's ASEA webcast entitled Finding, Tracking, and Responding the Issues of Current and Pending Legislation. To submit a question or comment at any time during the webcast, please click on the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen. Simply type your message into the box and then click Submit. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Brian Glick. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning if you're joining us from the West Coast. Glad to have you with us. Sean and I are here today to talk with you as members of the association and as leadership within the association, regional coordinators, state coordinators, those interested in tracking legislative issues within their state. This has become quite the thing going on around the country. Sean and I have been in communication with members from around the country about various pending legislation and proposed legislation from coast to coast, and we're glad to share this information with you. We have some basic information for you today. We've got some advanced information that we are going to release in terms of our legislative guides, and then hopefully be able to take quite a number of your questions today so that by the time you finish, that hopefully you will be well-versed in how to track this legislation and what to do with it. Sean is going to be joining us here momentarily. Great. There is Sean right now. So, Sean, did you want to say a few words?
Well, thanks, Brian. I apologize as many of you are probably experiencing on your campuses, it is the end of the year, and with that comes unexpected surprises, sometimes showing up at your office door. So I was grabbed and wasn't able to jump on as early as I wanted to. So I apologize, and I thank Brian for getting things started. I'm not sure what Brian talked about before, but as one of the co-chairs of this committee with Brian, obviously we're doing a lot of work on this end of tracking particularly state legislation, and it's something that obviously needs the eyes and ears of not just a couple people who are only in two parts of the country. So it's something that we need staff and colleagues all around the country looking at what's going on in their local areas and in their states in order to be most effective at this as an association. Moving forward, what we're trying to accomplish here today is making sure that everyone knows why this is an important thing, and I think for the most part, people are aware of how legislation, particularly in the recent times, has really impacted our work. Understanding what role the ASEA has in not only in advocacy, but also making sure that members are aware of what's going on a state-by-state and a national level. And also is making sure that you have the tools and the ability to go about doing this for yourself. And that's how we get better at this as a profession and better at this as an association, is when we have more people out there with the skills and the desire to look at what's going on in their neck of the woods and making others aware. Because something may look like it's only happening in one state, but once it starts happening in two or three, then we start noticing national trends, and we can really have a national response, and in terms of messaging, in terms of talking points, in terms of what is ASEA's perspective on these issues. So these first few, I guess up to about the halfway up through the presentation, we'll be talking a little bit about the legislative process and where some of the issues we're dealing with generate from. I think a lot of you may know what the legislative process looks like, but just to give you a brief synopsis, bills and legislation are initially filed or proposed within the federal or the state legislatures. Not every bill that gets proposed becomes something that turns into law. In fact, as I'm sure a lot of you know, most of those bills that are proposed don't become law. But it's oftentimes something that gets proposed year after year that sometimes takes some time to get traction. So that's really the first step. And after a bill is proposed, it gets referred to a specific committee. As we talk about ways to stay engaged at your state and also the federal level, it's good to know where do the bills in your state that deal with higher education, where do they get referred to? Some states have specific higher education committees. Some lump them in with a lot of other different areas that the legislatures cover. If you're looking at the U.S. Senate, education is lumped in with health, it's education, labor, and pensions. So it's different in each legislature. Sometimes after something's been referred, sometimes things just stay in committee and nothing happens. Other times the members may hold hearings on a particular bill. And oftentimes that's often a way, too, to get particular actors in to talk, and sometimes, frankly, for legislators to try to make a point or to call someone to task, which we've seen sometimes with our higher education colleagues in some states. And then the committee will vote on that bill. So something needs to pass committee before it makes it forward to be eligible to pass through the entire legislative body. And just a passage by committee, while sometimes has usually a good omen for something, because the majority party is also the majority party on any committee, it's not a guarantee. After something is voted on by the legislative body, if it's passed, then it goes to whomever the executive might be, whether that's the governor or the president, which may sign it or veto it. And particularly in the case of federal legislation, if it's something that impacts federal actions, federal departments, it goes through a rulemaking process, as we've all become very aware of, particularly with the recent passage of the VAWA reauthorization. There was a very long and involved rulemaking process that went through the VAWA statute and the reauthorization and determined what do each of these provisions actually mean in the context of how the Department of Education does its work. So that process from start to finish can take a considerable period of time. So moving forward, what are the resources that you can utilize to be more aware of where legislation is coming from? Higher education media is a particularly good place to start. If you see articles that are being posed in the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed, are obviously the two big ones, but maybe even some more specialized media sources, that's a good place to see where a story kind of bubbles up and becomes maybe a national point or a national story. Your local media, particularly if you live in a metropolitan area where maybe you have a newspaper that has a section that dedicates time to education, or maybe they have a certain day of the week where they run education stories, that's a time to really focus on, if you know it's Saturday, that your paper will run a couple pages on education news, pick up that paper or go online to access it. It's a good spot to see what your state legislature particularly is doing. Your campus partners and your colleagues, if you have a governmental affairs office, your general counsel's office, maybe your public safety colleagues or other areas within student affairs that are throughout their own connections are bringing things to your attention, or you have conversations with them to say, listen, these are the type of things I'm interested in. If you hear of anything coming down the pike, please let me know. Particularly if you see this a lot, particularly at state institutions where there's strong connections with through governmental affairs offices with what's going on maybe at your state board of regents or with what's going on at your legislature. You see those bonds as being stronger at public institutions than private, but many private institutions too have governmental affairs offices. So utilize and make those connections. So advocacy groups like FIRE, groups that have issues that they are trying to advocate for or policies that they are trying to push at a federal and state level are often at the center and often may discuss or publicize their efforts. So find out who those groups are. If there's a local-based group, if there's a national groups, look at those groups and follow what they're doing and look at their news and what they're putting out there. Any legislative contacts that you may have yourself or through people at your institution. What often gets missed is that it's not really the legislators themselves that do a lot of the work. The staff members are really the keys to whatever is happening. They're the ones that can give you the heads up ahead of time if you have a relationship like that, and they're also the ones that have the ear of the congressperson or state legislator that may be proposing something or may have to vote on a bill that impacts us. So having connections to staff members is incredibly important. It's been very important for us here at ASEA in our ongoing efforts to have a say as to what's happening at the federal level. We're not necessarily having sit-downs with senators. We're having sit-downs with senators' staffs because they're the ones that really have an impact in that time to have those conversations with their bosses. looking at your, obviously within our own professional association, within ASEA, and with our colleagues, and possibly other professional associations as well, making those connections. And really, on a rudimentary level, it's going into your state's website and finding out where things are and how to use it and how to search it. You can become a master of Thomas for the federal level and use their database, but each state looks different. And with 50 different websites out there for 50 different state legislators, some have real in-depth ways that you can go and track things and give you the ability to get notices to your email or text messages to your phone to say, if something happens with this bill, I want to know a new thing happened, and it will send you a message. Some states don't have that. Some states you may have to pay for that type of access. So you need to really research your state's website and make sure that you know how to access it and move around it and how to search for the things you need to search for. And lastly, it's connecting with your state coordinator. If you know something's happening that you got wind of, who's your ASEA state coordinator, and pass them that information, because they are really at a position better than most other leaders in the association to connect with everybody in the state and maybe mobilize for action, whether that's with your state house or connecting with writing emails or letters, or just making making kind of a combined effort to connect with people who can make these decisions and vote on these measures. So moving forward, things that you can do to put you in a better position for when legislative issues occur and that you need to be responded to is the first is building those relationships. And that means on your campus, it means off campus, it means within ASEA, within your professional networks. The faster information gets around and gets to you, the quicker we all have a chance to respond. And we've found that time frame is incredibly important. Most of you maybe on this webinar are familiar with the law that passed in North Carolina a couple of years ago related to attorney representation. That hit us really completely by surprise. We had really no warning that anything was coming, and by the time we were aware and had a chance to respond, really it was too late to do anything substantive with it. We've had better luck in other states, but that ability to respond and having the time to do it is incredibly important. And the other part, too, is looking at making sure that obviously we have ASEA, and you as a professional may have a particular opinion, may have a particular viewpoint on an issue, but that's not enough. You need to know enough about what the opposition's point of view is. And this is what I talked about before of looking at advocacy websites, looking at advocacy groups that may have an opposite viewpoint of you or of the association. It's important to understand where those concerns come from, not only because it's just good to know, if people who may have a different opinion of yours and why they have that opinion, but also it makes it easier to respond to their concerns and concerns that you may get from state legislators or staff members to say, well, listen, these people are saying this about what you do as a profession. How do you respond to that? And we need to have the ability to respond to that in an effective way. So familiarizing yourself with those opinions is incredibly important. So we talked about finding legislation, looking at your state websites. The federal website is called Thomas. So that is the database of all pending federal legislation and past legislation. It also can go back several years as well. Looking at a site that I've come to like quite a bit called GovTrack, and GovTrack is not something that is run by the federal government, but it is something where it's a resource where they track legislation, but it also gives you some perspective in the terms of projections for passage. What's the chance it will get out of committee? What's the chance it will get out of the chamber or pass and be signed into law? You also notice when you look at that, most bills get a very low score on that front because most bills don't become law. But it's a great way to assess, what the reality of a situation is for that particular bill. Now, don't get overconfident if you see this bill has a 1% or 0% chance of passing according to GovTrack. That doesn't mean it won't get used as an amendment in a different bill. Doesn't mean that the next time it comes around it won't have more legislative support. So it doesn't mean it's a non-issue, but it gives you a good sense of where people who have a very good track record of predicting these things think about the bill. And also, obviously, looking at the media. The media is, we have to be paying attention to what's being said about our profession for a number of reasons. One is to be aware of these new issues as they come up, but also to know what what the line of debate is, what the line of conversation is about what we do, and if something we feel isn't correct, how do we rebut that, and how do we respond to that? So it's equally important in terms of that media narrative often drives legislation. I mean, in so many states that we've dealt with, we know that it's not these state legislators that are just coming up with these bills or proposals completely on their own. They are seeing things happening in other states. They are also following the media, and they're seeing, oh wow, this is something I think would work great in our state. So following what's being said can lead you to knowing what's going to happen in your state or what may happen. And also, we have an ASEA legislative guide that we will be sending out. There's really two versions of it. There's kind of a quick reference guide, but also a full guide that gives sample letters and references that can be used at the state level for responding and reaching out to legislators and staff members on pending legislation. So that's something that we'll be making available at the conclusion of the presentation.
Actually, Sean, if I can jump in, we've got that actually uploaded to the material section of this webinar as well right now. So whether you for those who are with us, if you wanted to go to that tab right now, you can download those two PDF documents, and then we're also going to be working with the central office, to publicize that information to everybody as well.
Great. Thank you, Brian. So my last thing I want to discuss here is just looking at when you see legislation, what are the things that you should look at when you're assessing a piece of legislation, not just for the content, but what are the legislative pieces that can help inform how to respond. One of the most important things to look at is who's sponsoring the bill. Oftentimes you will see that listed as there's a main sponsor, the person who proposed it, and there are oftentimes co-sponsors who are people that may not have drafted the bill or been involved with that, but they agree with it and they want their name attached to it as something they support. So this doesn't mean that everyone who votes for the bill becomes a sponsor, but these are people who are particularly supportive or in agreement with whatever it is being proposed. So look at that list, particularly at the state level, because that gives you a sense of where is this coming from. It helps you look at what's the party that's proposing this. Is it the majority party? Is it the minority party? They'll give you a sense of its chance for passage. Is it a bipartisan bill, which gives a completely different context? What's the timing of the bill's proposal? Oftentimes lots of legislators will propose a bill right before the completion of the legislative session, with the knowledge that it won't get passed or may not even you might not even have time to get sent to committee for any kind of debate or discussion. Because oftentimes, let's say it's an election year, and a particular legislator wants to be able to say, listen, I proposed the laws on these particular issues. So even if they know that the chances of it getting passed are very slim. So looking at your state legislature about that, but each state is different in terms of how long the legislature stays in session. So look at your calendar. Look at if you know your state. For instance, here in Connecticut, our legislative session I believe ends in May, because this is upcoming year's election year for our. It's June, because last year was the election year. So it'll end in June. If a bill gets proposed, in the middle of June, its likelihood of passing is much slimmer than a bill that's being proposed right now and talked about right now. So those are things to keep in mind. Look at the committee perspective. Are there any hearings? Is there any movement in the committee on this bill? Oftentimes something gets sent to committee and it just kind of dies there. Nothing happens to it. So that's another area to look at. And when you're looking at who proposed the bill, look at where they represent. Is there a college or university in their district? If there is, maybe there's a connection between the university and what's being proposed. There's something that occurred at that university that is triggering that legislator to make that proposal. Or there's a constituent possibly in that district that's connected to that university that's causing them to make that proposal. In particularly the attorney representation bills we've seen around the country, there's oftentimes there is a constituent concern that brings this to the table, an aggrieved student that feels as though they were wronged by their student conduct process, that is bringing that forward to a constituent that is somehow has a connection to higher ed. Also looking at, particularly if you are in an area where there's a high concentration of colleges and universities, you may have an opportunity to see a legislative history from that particular state senator or state rep regarding higher ed and their perspective on it, their voting record. look at what the implementation date of the proposed legislation is. Sometimes that's a hard date. Everything in this bill will be, is in effect as of July 2016, or it may say it goes into effect at a certain date, so many months after the passage of this bill, which makes it more of a flexible time frame depending on when it gets voted on. You see that sometimes. That's part of the proposed CASA bill at the federal level, is the implementation date depends on the passage date, not on a specific hard date. And also look at amendments that occur. Don't just take the proposal and run with that as this is what the bill is going to be. That doesn't happen very often. There will often be changes and amendments that occur during the process. And frankly, on our end, as advocates for the profession and for our processes, our goal may not necessarily be that a bill not pass, but that the bill passes in the right way. So our advocacy efforts should be geared many times towards making sure that the bill is being amended in a way that works with what we're doing on our campuses and shows understanding of our work. And that's where I think we have a lot of success in doing that. We're not saying don't pass this bill because students don't deserve to be represented. It's about what's the level of representation we're looking to have. And we've had some success on that in different states where things may pass, but it's passed in a way that is much more palatable than it was initially proposed. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brian. He's going to talk a bit more about ASEA's role in advocacy efforts from the association level.
All right. Thank you, Sean. There we go. Got that slide. I wanted to start by letting everybody know that, and you may or may not know this, that ASEA, by its definition, and by definition I mean how it is registered, we are a nonprofit entity. We are not registered as a lobbying entity. In fact, lobbying agencies and lobbying entities are required to register, and there are regulations that they have to follow. ASEA is not an advocacy group. It is not a lobbying group. And so, as such, when our association speaks up about legislation, federal or state, we need to be very careful about what it is that we are saying and about what our participation looks like. So I do want to make sure that everybody is aware of that. As Sean was talking before about have these connections and comment, and we're going to talk more about that here in just a moment. But it is very important for anybody who is speaking out on pending legislation, especially in the name of ASCA, and we'll talk about what that looks like and how that happens, to be very careful about what is said. We certainly want the comments. The legislators and their staff want the comments. They want the input. They seek this out so that it can produce some very good legislation, but we do need to be careful of that. As an association and in each of the states, Sean mentioned, we do look to support legislation which advances the profession. There have been several states who have picked up legislation, and it's in varying states, varying points in terms of where it sits right now, of having institutions denote on a transcript those who have been suspended or expelled from the institution, either in relation to a Title IX incident or just in general, somebody who's been separated from the institution, and what does that notation look like? Does such a notation exist? Take a look at the position paper from the association. The association supports that position and suggests that institutions place such a notation on a transcript. We believe that that is helpful. So when a person moves from institution to institution, that information is not lost and it's not buried, even though most institutions will say, if not all, will say, have you ever been suspended or expelled from another institution of higher ed? We do work with legislators and their staff to provide the best information on best practices. As a matter of fact, the association has been sought out to provide information about this, explain to us how the conduct process works. How is this different from a court case, a criminal matter, or civil matter for that matter, for that type of thing? And how can we make this work? How can we, as state legislators, federal legislators, put out a bill, create a law that will accomplish both of our practices and our processes? For instance, the state of Maryland actually sought out ASEA when it related to some pending legislation, and this happened a couple of months ago, and we were able to provide some information before it went to a hearing, and some of our members from the state of Maryland showed up and testified at that hearing. We've had other members, South Carolina, New York, North Dakota, all around the country that have been able to do that. As we talked about at the very beginning, we rely on all of our members to track legislation. The Public Policy and Legislative Issues Committee can help you to analyze that once you track it, but we need to know that it exists. It is the requirement written into the job description of every state coordinator to track state legislation within their state as it relates to student conduct, and then to pass that information up the chain to their regional coordinator, to the Public Policy Legislative Issues Committee, so that we can work to help you with analyzing that and responding. And Sean and I have been working with state coordinators around the country to respond to legislation, provide letters, and we talked about the scripts and putting out surveys to the membership to gather feedback, and we'll have more of that here in just a moment. Another resource is how the association will produce policy papers and position papers. I talked about transcript notation and best practices, hearing boards, all of those things that you've seen come through in the presidential updates from Laura Bennett, Matt Gregory before her, and what the association is doing on this front to be able to provide this information to legislators and their staff about what it is that we do, and to inform their practice and what they're doing with the legislation. The recently renamed Public Policy Legislative Issues Committee, which was formerly the Legislative Issues Committee, has been around in the association for many years, and our responsibilities are outlined here: tracking legislation, analyzing the legislation, advising the board of directors and the membership about what is upcoming, where it is, what do we think that the association's response should be, should there be any response, should we support this, should we not, and really advancing that advocacy effort in the name of the profession. And then also, of course, providing those resources to the association's membership and to the board of directors. I mentioned the guides that we've just recently released, as of today, that we'll be making available to all of our members, and we'll be able to walk through them here, so that really anybody can do this. Once you find this information, reach out to us. We will be glad to assist you with that, with analyzing it and what to do next. So once you find, here's where we get into the part of, here's what you do. If you're looking for kind of a step-by-step guide, here you go. Okay, you found something. There is pending legislation. Who do I talk to? What do I say? talk to your institutional administration, because it's potentially most likely going to impact your school. Obviously, you want to take a look at this. Is this going to affect only state entities, or is this going to impact everybody? We've seen many states that have written in legislation that says this is going to impact everybody. It does not matter whether or not you are a state-supported institution. You're a private institution. It's going to impact you. So you need to realize that. Let your administration know. Maybe your governmental affairs or legislative liaisons have already seen this. Maybe they haven't. So let folks know, hey, this is coming up. And then you can work as part of that institution to respond to that. Let your state coordinator know if you're not the state coordinator. If you are a state coordinator, let your regional chair know, hey, this is what's going on, because now your regional chair may reach out to everybody else in the region and say, hey, what do you see here, and is this coming up? And let Sean and I know. We'll be glad to help you analyze that. The members of our committee will be glad to help you analyze that legislation. We'll talk to you about what the next steps are. One of the things that we're going to share with you is that we suggest you let the members within your state know, the ASEA members within your state know. A lot of state coordinators have done a great job of this by putting together like a SurveyMonkey survey or a Qualtrics survey with a link to the legislation, to the text of the legislation, and soliciting feedback, sending out that link to the members, giving folks 7 to 10 days and saying, hey, read through this, tell us what you think. And then compiling that information, compiling that feedback, and then being able to provide that information in a well-thought-out letter with some solutions and some recommendations to the state legislators, so that they can consider that information as they move forward through that process that Sean was talking to us about before, the committees, the final voting, et cetera. And yeah, we talked about this on the last slide. One of the things that I definitely want to make sure to mention is when you compile this feedback and when you submit information to state legislators, take care not to criticize, but instead offer solutions. We like how this is. We have some concerns about what this particular provision says, but we think that it might be helpful if you went this way, and give them some solutions to that. That tends to be much better received than just, we don't like this legislation. And so that is definitely one of the things that we highlight, not only in this presentation, but then also in the legislative guides that you'll see. I talked before at the very beginning about ASEA is not an advocacy group. It's not a lobbying entity. Take care to follow your institutional policy. Many institutions have requirements and rules in place about who can speak on behalf of the institution when it comes to talking with state legislators, state entities. Be sure to know and follow your policy. You may very well be authorized to talk on behalf of the institution. As a matter of fact, we've had several instances from members around the country who have been ASEA members that are very knowledgeable about the association, about their institutional policy, that are vocal about critiquing legislation, and have not necessarily been initially the people who are designated to speak on behalf of the institution, but have been duly authorized, deputized, if you will, to do that. So that is, in fact, a possibility, but you need to follow that protocol. you are always welcome to speak for yourself and to submit letters, correspondence to state legislators or to the federal legislators, letting them know, hey, you worked in student conduct, you have an interest in this bill, here's some information that they might want to consider. There is the ability to represent ASEA if it's authorized by the board of directors. That obviously comes from the board saying, yes, you can speak. We tend to see this a lot through state coordinators when the state is submitting information on behalf of the members within that state, that's how that letter is signed. The board of directors has sent letters and correspondence to various state legislators issuing support or critique of various legislation. We put up here, don't underestimate legislative staff, and Sean was talking about that before, and it's a point worth reiterating. The staff are the ones with the legislator's ear, and that's really where a lot of these decisions are made, and it is who ends up writing a lot of the legislative language. It's very much like the various courts around the country. It's, yes, the judges sign off on the opinions, but it's a lot of the law clerks that actually do the case law research and write those decisions, and that's whose voice is really truly heard. So having those relationships with legislative staff are very, very important. And then follow up. This is not just a once-and-done thing. Continue that conversation until you know when that legislation ceases to progress in the process of becoming a law. You do want to let everybody know. What does the institution know? What have the members around the state heard? And certainly what has the National Association heard, and if we can be of assistance. So this last slide is a very short excerpt from the legislative guides that you will see in the material section that we'll make available. But we wanted to at least share with you what this looks like and provide you some information as a very quick reference to, if you want to respond, here's a way that you can do that, and there is no problem with just taking and copying this and then obviously filling in the appropriate information. You've got brackets or X's in there. There's some bullet points, bold face type. Obviously, you'll fill that in. And of course, as things come up, as various pieces of legislation come up, because it's not always going to be attorneys in the process or transcript notation or iterations of the Campus Accountability and Security Act, the CASA Act, as it's been related to, or other Title IX issues. It's going to be something else in the future. And so let the Public Policy Legislative Issues Committee know that how we can help. Let us know that it's there, and we'll help you to analyze that and to move forward with that. Know that you are never out there on your own. This is not just your responsibility. There are resources there to help you. So with that, we wanted to take some questions. I see that there are a couple, and Sean, I don't know if you've been looking at them, and if you wanted to start with those questions, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. There was a question about how does ASEA work with other associations related to these issues. And we do work with other associations and conversations. We've signed on to some joint letters with NASPA. I'm not sure if those listening knew about the joint letter we signed that went out to all the state legislators, that Laura signed on behalf of ASEA. that went out to the 50 state legislatures related to the mandatory referral bills that were popping up related to sexual misconduct and mandatory referrals to law enforcement. So ASEA, NASPA, several other, I believe ASEA, and several victim support and advocacy associations signed on to that. So there are definitely times when that occurs. I think also, though, from an ASEA perspective, it's been important that we establish our voice as a voice for student conduct. And definitely there are several departments within the federal government and several legislative staff members that have really come to view us as such, and that's, as an association aim, I think that's an appropriate aim for the association to try to establish those credentials when it comes to something that relates directly to student conduct work. And obviously, NASPA and the ACPA, their legislative and public policy goals are a much broader set of goals than ours are as an association because of the breadth of those associations and all the different areas that they touch. We definitely want to be able to, though, as ASEA, to promote the expertise of our members when it comes to these specific types of areas. Brian, if you want to take the other one.
Yeah. The other question asks, can you speak up as a private citizen who happens to work as a student conduct officer? But there's a concern that only speaking up as a private individual would lessen the weight of that response, of that person's voice. Absolutely, you can speak up. As we shared in the presentation, you are always welcome to speak up as a private citizen. It's always been the right of citizens in this country. In terms of whether or not that would lessen the weight of your voice, maybe, maybe not. As Sean and I shared, that as an association, we are getting our voice out there, and that there are legislators that are seeking us out. I mentioned the Maryland example, and there are others that are out there as well, and that's going to continue. One of the things that you can include when you reach out is you can say, I work at this institution, I am a member of ASCA, and while I'm not speaking on behalf of those entities, that may very well get their attention because legislators are seeking us out. And for someone to say, I am a part of this organization, I value what the association stands for, and for the legislator to know, okay, I'm aware of this association, that may very well strengthen your voice, not necessarily weaken it and diminish it. And then, of course, by all means, feel free to talk with Sean and I and the committee as a whole, the other members of the committee, so that we can help you to craft that correspondence and hopefully help you to get your foot in the door and have that voice heard and have your communication heard about the pending legislation. That's all the questions we have right now. If there are other ones, by all means, please feel free to submit them. We do have some time left if folks have them.
Yeah, and I think one thing too, just to add on here at the end, is that the ability of our members at the state level to have an impact on what's going on with state legislative issues and state legislative initiatives and what may be coming down the pipe regarding any proposals, really hinges upon the members within a particular state engaging and being active and participating in that conversation. So when a state coordinator reaches out and says, I'm looking for feedback on this, is something that we should, speak on, as an association, not necessarily as a representative of your institution, but as ASCA members in whatever state. If you just let that lie and don't respond and don't participate in that conversation, then there is no voice. It can't just be left to the state coordinator to try to make that make that argument or make that claim, or have Brian and I step in and try and do that. Because frankly, if we're not constituents in your state, they don't really have much use for us. Oftentimes, they want to hear from people who are their constituents. Now, obviously, the ASEA as an association does have a voice, but they want to hear constituents voice those complaints. I'm in Connecticut. My voice has less value to the Virginia or Kansas legislature than someone who lives in Virginia or Kansas. So it's important that if you're in those states and are part of that, are part of our association, and you hear things going on, that you really need to take that action up and pick up that flag within your state. And make sure that you're heard, because your voice does have more value if you're from that state and are in that state.
Another question here. Should we pay attention to K12 bills involving campus safety, conduct, or violence, the trickle-down effect? Absolutely. It's you do want to keep an eye on those. Very often, K-12 bills are, in fact, just that, applicable to K-12. But there definitely have been times when it has trickled down, trickled up, however you want to look at that, and has an impact on higher education. And then there are times when it is actually written into the law that this applies not only to K-12, but it applies to all institutions of education, higher education and otherwise. So the legislators do realize that there definitely is a connection to between higher education and primary and secondary education.
Yeah, and related to that, it's there are a couple other ways or things that you should look at when it comes to K-12 laws as well, and it's if there's things that occur on higher education campuses, if you have media incidents that occur or incidents that occur that draw a lot of attention, I should say. I'll give you as an example. You look at, from several years ago, the Jerry Sandusky scandal. What occurred from after that, there were a number of different states modified their laws to make sure that higher education professionals were also mandatory reporters for child abuse. Because in a number of states, they weren't, including, my state here. Connecticut changed their law in a response to that scandal. So, in the past, it just said K-12 employees were mandatory reporters and higher education employees were not. So that was a change that included included higher education within an existing K-12 regulation. Another way of looking at it, too, is whatever sort of provisions related to safety or conduct for K-12 oftentimes sets expectations for parents and students when they are entering higher education. So it may be good to know what students in your state, what kind of the parameters of the regulations in their K-12 world, because we see this a lot too, particularly with students who are coming in with accommodations for disabilities, expect the exact same thing when they come into higher education and think it's going to be the same exact setup, where in that case it is often not. So it's important to know that too, just from a perspective of interacting and interacting with your students and with their parents of those students that are coming to your campuses. So I don't know if we have any other questions, or we might be able to wrap it up now, Brian.
Yeah. So finally, Sean and I wanted to share with you our contact information, the central office, their email address and phone number. Feel free to contact us if we can be of help, the rest of the committee. If you're interested in joining the Public Policy Legislative Issues Committee, let Sean and or I know, and we'll be glad to have you on board. We're open to everybody, and no prior experience required. We'll get you all of the information and opportunities to take a look at legislation and really impact where our profession is going as it relates to to legislation. Sean, anything you wanted to say in closing?
No, I just thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for coming on a Friday. I know it's a busy time of year for everybody, so we appreciate you coming out here and listening to what we have to say, and hopefully being able to use what we have to say and back at your home institutions and within your state. So like Brian said, if you have any follow-up questions or anything you want to talk to us about, just feel free to touch base.
Thank you, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude today's webcast. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time and have a great weekend.